And so just a reminder, the recording is now started, and the event presentation will be available on the chapter's YouTube channel in a couple of days. And so now to kick things off, I'm going to introduce today's moderator. Kenneth Martin is an architect and the founding principal of the Obsidian Group. This is it's an architecture firm in operation since 1991. His firm has had 4 offices along the eastern US, concentrating on school projects, projects for higher education, religious facilities, and pharmaceutical projects. Ken is a former national president of the National Association of Minority Architects, NOMA. He was the state president for North Carolina NOMA, which received the National Award for the Most Improved Chapter. He is currently president of the Virginia chapter of NOMA, and he recently joined the board of directors for AIA Virginia. Welcome, Ken.
I usually start out talking about how I'll send you a check in the mail, but I'm going to have to chastise you a little bit because it's the National Organization of Minority Architects, not Association. So you get 2 demerits, and your check will not be in the mail. So there you go. Anyway, thanks, folks. I appreciate you joining us today, and I'm going to introduce our speakers for this morning and afternoon. First up is Lisa Ferretto, who's a principal and sustainability director and architect, and has been with Ford Copeland Mott since 2005. She's worked on a variety of project types and has worked on approximately 3 million square feet of LEED certified space. Lisa promotes the integrity of sustainability and well-being throughout the entire design process and consults on projects across all studios. Lisa describes herself as an urban scientist, studying the interconnected systems of people with each other, nature, and cities. She's a member of the Baltimore Sustainability Commission, advocating for environmental equity, and she has recently been featured as one of the top 10 women fighting or leading the fight against climate change by WOW, the Women of the World, and Google Arts and Culture. Next, after Lisa, is Melanie Ray, and she's also a licensed architect. And she's an associate in the housing and mixed use and planning sector at, again, Ford Copeland Mott. So they have a little dynasty going on there. Since graduating from Penn State's architecture program in 2015, she's worked on various mixed use and affordable housing projects, as well as community development projects in Baltimore City and beyond. She's the 424th living Black woman licensed in the U.S. to practice architecture and seeks to be an active mentor to promote the goal of doubling the number of licensed Black architects by 2030. Yay, Melanie. She currently serves as the vice president of the Baltimore chapter of NOMA, Be More NOMA, the Northeast University liaison for NOMA National, and a member of the AIA Baltimore Board of Directors. And so without further ado, let me introduce Lisa and Melanie, and you guys can take it from here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, AIA Architecture for Education and Committee on the Environment and NOMA for putting this together and connecting the dots of what we're going to be talking about today. This is the description that you guys all signed up for. I won't read it, I'll just sort of jump right in. And I'll start with, as Ken mentioned, I'm a sustainability architect, and sustainability advocates often talk about sustainability as this triple bottom line or this 3-legged stool. You've probably heard the 3 E's: environment, economy, equity, the 3 P's: planet, prosperity, and people. I often talk about it as 3 different environment systems, but can we also look at it through the lens of environmental justice? and through the lens of health and well-being. So health is, according to the World Health Organization, physical, mental, and social well-being. It's not merely the absence of something like COVID, and it's the fundamental right of every human being. So can we think about the health and well-being of our people and our communities and our planet? The CDC says that the physical social environment is the major determinant of someone's health. So as architects and designers of the built environment, we are responsible for people's health in our world. And if this is true, this means that the place and the body into which you are born determines your health, your life expectancy, and lots of other things. So zooming a little bit into myself and my background, I was born in Baltimore City in East Baltimore. I grew up with my dad and my grandmother. This is her backyard. And early on in education, this was third grade, I believe, I was inspired by a teacher. I don't remember exactly what the assignment was, but I started thinking about these interconnected environments back then. So I guess this is me, and this is my connection to nature. There's human connection, the built environment. If you can read this, I'm growing food. I'm using the greenhouse effect. This is an unbuilt project, but I did get a 100 on it. Since that project, I finished grade school, high school, went out to Portland, Oregon to really study environmental architecture, and came back to my hometown of Baltimore in 2005 and started this research project called Sustain Baltimore ASAP. So the ASAP stood for this Assessment Study Action Plan. How can you know where you want to go unless you know where you're coming from? But I also was using the phrase ASAP to address this urgency of this triple crisis of environmental, social, and economic of what was happening in Baltimore. So I studied the physical environment, the natural environment, and also really started looking at that social environment. And I noticed this pattern that when you looked at social things like poverty, family income, owner-occupied homes, education, the state of Maryland was always well above sort of the national average. The city of Baltimore was always below the state. And if you layered race into the city of Baltimore, the African American, that percentage dropped even further down. This was an article that came out a couple years ago, Baltimore's economy in black and white. But you could take that word economy and replace it with any of these other words, and you would see this pattern on this map. The first map on the top is economic insecurity, percent of households earning less than $25,000. The bottom right is percent of African American residents. So you can see how these line directly up. The same thing, the same pattern emerged with COVID. The cases of COVID, the rate at which people were getting COVID, who were the most exposed residents of the city. And of course, those most exposed residents were those making the least amount of money. This is pandemic unemployment assistance. This is digital access, households with no internet at home. Dr. Lawrence Brown called this pattern that you see on the map the black butterfly. And it's this historical combination of policies, practices, systems, and budgets that were put in place years ago, back in 1937, and they still are holding and producing injustices today. So this residential security map, again, we call it the redlining map. They actually drew red and yellow lines around areas that banks should not lend to. These were neighborhoods predominantly occupied by African Americans, immigrants, older housing stock. And when you lay this across the line with the 1937 map and these maps today of race, income, unemployment, things like that, you can see how this pattern continues. In every historically redlined African American community in East West Baltimore, 50% of households do not have access to a car. So as a sustainability advocate, you think this is great, right? People are using public transportation. But the thing about data is to sort of look into it a little bit more. And when you start to look at the commute times, the average Baltimorean commute time is 31 minutes. 2/3 of transit riders have a 90-minute commute. So what does this mean to someone's quality of life, time they spend with their families, and so on? Home ownership is often, right, called the primary driver of wealth, and the ladder up to move to other items of wealth and education. And this pattern just still continues, right? Maryland's above the national average, Baltimore's below, African Americans below that. So how, as architects and designers and advocates, how do we support programs in our communities? This is one in Baltimore that I like, Black Women Build, the sweat equity nonprofit to really increase home ownership in the city. So redlining didn't just happen in Baltimore, it happened all across the nation. This is a site called Mapping Inequality. You can see the red line was considered hazardous, the yellow line was definitely declining. Once you click on a city, you can then click on a specific part of that city and it will tell you why they didn't lend in that area. This is another website from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Again, lots of Virginia cities listed, and again, all across the country. This one will align the old redlining map with the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. Again, this one's really cool because you can do it as an interactive map. Again, you can sort of pick one neighborhood and connect it across. Richmond, Virginia has their own site. And again, it's just astounding that this is happening all across the country. The 1930s map, minority populations, unemployment, you can layer in urban heat island, heat vulnerability, all the way to COVID risk, back to right planet and to health of the people. So what is our role and responsibility and intention as the architect and construction profession? How have we supported these policies and systems with our work? I'm sure a lot of you are AIA members since this is an AIA webinar, but I just like to show this as a reminder for non-AIA members in the audience. This is what we stand for: to advance the quality of life, to protect health, safety, and welfare, improve the built environment. We stand for equity. We stand for protecting communities from climate change, economic opportunity. We have a code of ethics that says that we have an obligation to the public, an obligation to the environment, so that people have access to clean air, so that we support human health and well-being. I often ask myself if architecture, design, and development have these things built in to what we're supposed to be doing, right? Improving the quality of something that's carefully designed, a particular intention. Why do I need to call myself a sustainable architect? Why do we have to have something called sustainable design? Historically, we built things based on our climate zone. We know this, right, is in the Northeast. We know this one's in the Southwest. And it was really based on our location on the planet. Throughout time, though, right, we're designers, we're innovative. Things like elevators and air conditioning really changed the architecture of design. But as a sustainability person, we have to think about, right, 7 generations out. Why did it take 50, 80, 60 years to think about emissions out of cars, efficiency for air conditioning, light air zoning regulations to people on the street? Why did it take 30 years to ban the redlining practice? And why 80 years later are we still experiencing that injustice in our communities? We now sort of have this loss of connection to our place, each other, and to the planet. And housing, when you can pick any sort of category and sort of zoom into it a little more, our family size have gotten much smaller, but our houses have gotten larger. Transportation, our cars have gotten bigger, not necessarily that much more efficient. People are overall less healthy. There's all these environmental impacts going on. The architecture and construction industry infrastructure, we are responsible for 50% of the CO2 emissions on the planet. So is this improvement? Is this what we've intended to do as architects? So can we stop, pause, rethink, and reset? And COVID-19 was this crisis, and crisis comes from a word that means critical moment, turning point. And we saw, this is a map, I'm sure you guys all are familiar with this, right? Johns Hopkins maps of connecting these dots of COVID-19 across the whole planet. This was a popular cartoon that came out, right? Wash your hands, everything's going to be fine. And so it's great we're connecting the dots across the planet with COVID. But what about our communities, the economy, the recession? What about climate change? How do we connect the dots all the way back and think about these things together? When COVID hit, I noticed another pattern. The United States is 5% of the population, and we're 25% of the COVID cases. This is similar to when you think about energy, right? We're 5% of the population, 25% of the energy. So the difference here with being at a turning point is, what are we going to do next? These two confusing graphs on the right, I'll explain them. The top right is one about COVID. It was about a year ago. People are deciding, should we do a mask mandate? Should we not? What does this mean for deaths during COVID? Bottom one is about climate change. What happens if we meet our climate carbon targets? What if we don't? So there's that pre-crisis, the old normal, the during the crisis, right, what we're living through now. But what's next? Do we want to project where we were going? Do we want to go on a new path? We know the projected growth of energy is that it's just going to keep growing 50% in the next 30 years. We know that increased energy increases carbon, increases temperatures of the land and the ocean and the planet. 2020 was the hottest year on record, and the last 10 was the hottest decade. We know that higher temperatures mean sea level rise. This is a great map. You can go in and type in any city and see what a sea level rise will mean. This is what it looked like in West Baltimore a couple years ago. So again, as architects, as designers, as advocates for our communities, how do we help support things like community preparedness, resiliency plans, things like that in our cities? And how do we also connect back to student engagement, to those people who have never heard about architecture and living in the city? How do we inspire student activists? It's hard to talk about carbon and connect that back to people. This image, this 1 ton of carbon, this was done for a UN climate change conference, not the one that just happened, it was a few years ago. And so 1 ton of carbon, it's a 27-foot cube. And these artists put it all around the city. So as people walked around, they were visually impacted by this. A 1 ton of carbon is the amount of carbon a household releases in a month. In the United States, it's probably every 2 weeks. So if you can imagine living in a Baltimore City row house, every 2 weeks you come out, you see one of these dropped on your street, the 20 other houses in your neighborhood, that is the carbon that we're putting into the environment. We know that these climate extremes are happening all across the planet. And architects have said that this is a health, safety, and welfare crisis. It's our responsibility to protect our clients' communities and our earth. A lot of the architects on the call, I'm sure you guys have signed up for the 2030 challenge. This is our path to 2030 to get to carbon neutrality. We're also now talking about embodied carbon, zero carbon by embodied carbon by 2040. The World Health Organization says that if we can lower air pollution, we will directly increase the health benefits to the people and avoid 12.7 of deaths. So again, if we can reduce energy, we can reduce carbon, reduce pollution, reduce health risks, which then reduce COVID risk factors. And it also reduced operating costs. A lot of residents in cities across the country are experiencing something called energy burden. Here in Baltimore, low-income households, it's over 3% than the medium energy burden. And then if you look at Black households, it's 43% higher than white non-Hispanic households. So this is, right, this families deciding, do I pay the energy bill? Do I pay rent? Do I buy food? Do I buy medicine? Do I buy Christmas gifts? Again, we keep bringing this back to what can we do as architects in our schools, in our housing mixed use, in any of our projects to make our projects more energy efficient? How can we support other programs in our cities for weatherization for existing buildings to help our communities? So the AIA has done a great job in identifying this as a climate emergency and just basically saying that architecture must change. They've also, the AIA has had a great response to COVID. They were listed as one of the 100 associations that will save the world in this coronavirus response category. They had task forces, assessment tools. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the strategies for safer schools, or even involved with this great report that came out that helped architects help our clients open schools. And schools are so important, which is why this is part of this committee, the Architecture for Education. 1 in 6 people in the United States steps foot in a school every day. 50 million students, 100,000 public schools, 2 million acres of land, 7.5 billion gross square feet. But we know schools are not spending what they need to keep their buildings up to date. And part of this is because they're prioritizing security, right, which is a whole other webinar. Back to the energy and indoor quality, you can see some of these statistics. Indoor air quality, outdated HVAC, outdated ventilation, and the amount of money being spent on energy. So again, how do we improve indoor air quality, improve energy efficiency, so that we can reduce pollution, have healthier people, and then it improves student performance, student outcomes, and then again, that reduced operating budget. We know where we learn matters. And I'm going to take you on just a little case study, and I want to do it through the AIA Design Excellence Framework. Again, the AIA is trying to make these connections between equitable communities, energy, wellness, and well-being. And I won't go through all 10 of these, but I just wanted to frame it in this way. The case study is Green Street Academy, which is in West Baltimore. It was a high school built in 1925, beautiful building, but then it sat vacant for almost 30 years. And what was great about Green Street Academy was it had a mission that they really wanted to inspire their students to imagine their careers through the prism of sustainability. And the executive director at that time wanted the school to be a driver in environmental and, more important, economic and sustainability in the community. We renovated the school. At the time, it was the second largest LEED Platinum project on the planet. Of course, we talked about energy reduction, converted that back to carbon. But in terms of money, this saved the school about $100,000 a year that they could put back into the neighborhood and into community projects, student health and well-being. And the student health and well-being, we really wanted to look at daylight and views, lighting, thermal comfort, to talk about the student outcome. Years later, some of my talented colleagues got a Upjohn grant, and we wanted to do a research study on biophilic learning spaces on student success. Biophilia, if you've heard of that phrase, is humans, we have an innate tendency to seek connections to nature and to other forms of life. There was a book put out a few years ago called 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design by Terrapin Bright Green. This was one of our research partners. And they described biophilic design strategies in 14 patterns in 3 different categories. Again, this could be, again, a whole nother webinar on biophilic design, but I just want to talk about 3 of them in this research case study. And the science is based on something called attention restoration theory. And this was by a researcher named Kaplan, 1995. But basically students, and you say people in general, right? We get stressed, we're anxious, we're fatigued. we can have a restorative experience. That's a view out into nature, a walk in a forest. It could be exercise. And then our attention is restored, much like a battery that's depleted that can be filled again. There's a lot of research and evidence overview of biophilic design to attention restoration, stress recovery, working memory, even beyond education to hospital stays. Back to our research study, we wanted to just look at student stress and learning outcomes. So this is an image of the Biophilic Classroom. This is an image of the control classroom. So notice in the control classroom, right, that the blinds are down. There's lots of visual sort of noise on the wall. And so we looked at 3 biophilic patterns. The first one is this visual connection with nature. This is just background research to back this up. But what we physically did for this project was that we worked with our landscape architects in the school, and we built a garden outside of the classroom. Dynamic and diffuse light, we installed these blinds so that even if the teacher felt like they wanted to put the blinds down, there was still some diffuse light and patterns coming through. And then biomorphic forms and patterns. This was the carpet and the wall installation. We looked at assessment in different ways, but my favorite are these quotes from the students. I'm more comfortable. It's easier for me to focus. It makes me feel good. The learning outcomes, right, are really just outstanding results. So the control classroom's in the gray, the biophilic is in the green. And in September, when we started the research, they both sort of started off at the same place, in both of these outcomes. But by March, the biophilic classroom had 3 times 3 higher test score and 7% more students testing at grade level. So how do we increase the student learning outcomes and student well-being in our schools? And most people say we have to build green schools, right? We increased health and well-being, not only of the students, but of all the staff and faculty. We reduce that environmental impact. We reduce operating costs. And we also, this last point, we increase environmental justice and sustainability literacy of the students as they move forward in their lives. Green schools are also a way to hold ourselves accountable. It's putting a nutrition label, giving our schools a report card. Regardless of which rating system or standard you look at, there's different, there's common categories among all of them. Living, Building Challenge, and Well really start to talk about health, happiness, equity, beauty, things like that. And Well really reached out to science, to doctors, to researchers to make this connection between the built environment and our human body systems. So it wasn't surprising when COVID hit, when we looked at the Well rating system, there were already a handful or a couple handfuls of existing credits that talked to things that ASHRAE and other people were telling us that we needed to do in our buildings. They came up with a task force. They had strategies to support the fight against COVID. They also had a Bridging the Gap report for facilities fundings for schools. LEAD also came out during COVID with some pilot credits. So again, you were able to layer this into projects that you're already working on and to think about even social equity in pandemic planning. They already had in place some social equity innovation credits for the project team, for the community, for the supply chain. They had a checklist for social impact. The Living Building Challenge I mentioned had credits and categories in equity, beauty and biophilia, education and inspiration. They also have something called the JUST label. So beyond the buildings that we design, we have to think about the organizations that we worked in. JUST is a transparency label for your company. It talks about gender diversity, ethnic diversity, pay scale equity, things like that. Eco-districts is one of my favorite rating systems. It's really the imperatives of climate, equity, and resilience, and how these things need to be looked at the same time. And so that old phrase, think globally, act locally, is still very valid today. The UN has sustainable development goals to transform our world. And in Baltimore City, we also have a sustainability plan where we look up to these planetary goals, but also bring them back to what it means to our city specifically. And we do that through something called the equity lens. We have an equitable implementation plan because we can't meaningfully work for sustainability without deliberately addressing all of these other environmental disadvantages that are still relevant today. And now I'm going to pass it off to Melanie to talk more about equity in our profession.
Thanks, Lisa. So again, my name is Melanie Ray. I'm the Vice President and Treasurer of Be More NOMA here in Baltimore. And so NOMA is the National Organization of Minority Architects. It's a national organization, and we recently celebrated our 50th anniversary this past year. We strive to support communities of color specifically through activism and empowering our local chapters through membership, as well as to foster justice and equity in communities. And one aspect in which we achieve this is through promoting equity in the profession itself. And so this really ties back to, similarly with the AIA, that our mission as architects is equity in the work that we do. But before we can talk about the solutions, and some of these solutions, so eloquently presented by Lisa earlier, that we are able to do as architects in the built environment, we first have to assess where we are as a profession. So currently today, there are about 116,000 architects across the US. I want to take some time to highlight the current state of our profession, because it's really the reason why we're going to be having this discussion today. So out of over 100,000 architects in the US, only 2% of those architects are Black, despite the Black community representing 14% of the national population. And this is even more staggering when you consider the fact that the overall number of architects continues to rise year after year, but the proportion of Black architects has remained stagnant over the course of the last decade. We're seeing an increase in diversity in the professional in general, but we're just not seeing those numbers within the one community that has been marginalized, arguably, the most over time. And those numbers are even lower for Black women specifically. Last year, we actually reached a milestone last November, reaching 500 architects, Black women architects, which was an amazing feat for us to achieve. But we really still have a long way to go. In my introduction, it was mentioned that I'm only the 424th living Black woman architect at the time of being licensed. And so what can we do to continue to push those numbers even more? Today, we're just over at 532. So again, before we can begin to talk about strategies to promote the diversity within the profession, we first have to understand what the driving factors are that are contributing to this issue. So NCARB every year releases the By the Numbers report, which is a really great detailed report that I encourage everyone to take a look at, particularly if you are interested, and everyone needs to be interested in engaging in this work, as it really highlights a lot of the disparities within the profession. And so I've pulled a couple of that, a little bit of that data here. So the first one is really the most jarring, that African-American candidates are the least likely to pass all of the ARE 5.0 divisions. What can we be doing to really address that number? Because ultimately passing those divisions is going to lead to licensure, and again, kind of going back to achieving those goals. Likewise, in the second image, what was most interesting this past year, going back to the impacts of COVID-19, with the closures of the testing centers, with the lack of access to certain resources over the course of the year, overall, that number of architects has declined. The number of licensed architects that achieved licensure during 2020 declined during the pandemic. And what we saw earlier in the research that Lisa presented is that these impacts are disproportionately affected by Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color. And licensure is no exception here. And then in the last image, focusing on that third paragraph, that Black candidates are even taking longer within that licensure process, that getting started, finishing the process, and getting through your experience hours and through those testings is really even more of a challenge, specifically for the Black community. And so what does this mean? In the long run, we're seeing less and less African Americans are finishing the licensure process. And oftentimes this is really due to external forces beyond their control. This means less Black architects in positions of leadership at the highest levels of national firms, less Black owned firms, less Black project managers, and overall a less diverse profession. And so those of us who have achieved licensure, by nature of being members of AIA, by picking up the mantle of architecture, really have an obligation to support the next generation of designers across all ethnicities, but particularly in those groups that are the most underrepresented. So looking locally, we can start to see how many of those candidates dropped out of the process of licensure that were lost in COVID-19. And so looking at each of these demographics, and I pulled Virginia out specifically just in keeping with our audience today, we can look at the why behind each of these numbers. We need to start asking questions as to what are the impacts behind this information. So, yes, 14% completed the process, but of that 86 who did not complete the AXP process, how many of those were BIPOC designers who perhaps did not have a mentor, did not have the appropriate supportive working environment that fostered that growth? Of that 67% completion rate, but overall, only 40 overall completions this year. What should we be doing to ensure that the individual exam successes are turned into a full, complete process of the area, passing one or two exams here and there, but let's focus on perhaps some of those tougher exams, or how can we continue to support that for those candidates? In terms of completion timeline, Virginia, as a state, the statistics are spot on with the national standard, but how does this compare across racial and gender boundaries, particularly in looking at those numbers for 2020 with those rising incoming architects? And finally, how can we continue to be investing in local professional development? Northern Virginia has a really high concentration of transient architects, those who live in Maryland or DC and work in Virginia or vice versa. And so are we providing those resources both locally and abroad to support those candidates elsewhere? So why exactly is this important? The question of why diversity is important is one that is continually asked, and I will always support pushing that initiative forward. And so why it's important, really authentic team diversity is becoming more and more in demand, both of our clients, of our future employees, of our future employers. There are, a number of RFPs that are coming out that are asking, how are you authentically showing that you are a diverse organization, at all levels, not just at the intern and entry level, but at principal board level positions. And there's a real distinction between authentic diversity and the performative diversity, or trying to count people where they make sense. The emerging professionals, oh, sorry, go back. Thank you. The emerging professionals are demanding it as part of their initial interviews. Many times in the past couple of years, I've gone to career fairs and they're asking, how diverse is your firm? If you can't show me that someone like me, someone who looks like me is in the upper levels of your profession, of your firm, then I don't want to work at a firm that is not going to demonstrate that support. And so by this math, we actually, so I also want to highlight the other 2030 challenge that we are striving for. And so we all know the 2030 challenge with regards to reductions in energy usage and sustainability. But doubling the number of Black architects by 2030 is our other challenge. And so NOMA has partnered with the AIA Large Firm Roundtable to achieve these goals and really start to push those efforts forward. And so what does that look like? That actually looks like it's an average of at least 40 Black architects need to be licensed each month between now, starting in January of 2022 to 2030. We are a long ways away from achieving those numbers, but what can we do to start to push the needle and move the needle forward so that we can achieve these numbers? And so one initiative that NOMA has started in partnership with the Large Firm Roundtable is the NOMA Foundation Fellowship, which guarantees internship opportunities for our NOMA students in some of these top firms. And so as a profession, as an organization, both with AIA and NOMA, we have a responsibility to continue to provide some more initiatives like this. And so NOMA National as an organization, the backbone of our initiatives is the pipeline, the development of the pipeline. And so starting with our signature program, the Project Pipeline Summer Architectural Program for middle and high school students, we attempt to provide touch points throughout each point of the development of youth and young adults and following them through licensure. And so Project Pipeline is a program that many NOMA chapters across the country facilitate and provide. And so the idea is after you finish that project pipeline as a student, you would then enroll in architecture school, join a NOMA chapter. If you're at an HBCU, a historically Black college and university, joining our professional development program to ensure that you're continuing to get that exposure into the profession. I mentioned the NOMA Foundation Fellowship, getting internships. Are you getting mentorship? Are you getting that guidance so that you understand what the licensure process is like and what's required of getting those experience hours and those testing? And then finally, becoming licensed and understanding what your options are as a licensed professional and being able to move through your practice. And so where do we start? Here in Baltimore, we like to find opportunities where students not just have that exposure, but are really showing that interest and then just need that extra push to really guide them. And so what we've found here in the city is that there are aspiring architects in schools and in programs in our own backyard here, and they're just looking for those advocates to support them through the process. So what you see on the screen is a map of all of the career and technology development programs with construction and development in their curriculum. These are students who are already introduced to the tools of the trade. So they're taking AutoCAD, they're learning architectural drafting, they're learning plans and sections and all of these different tools that we are using. But what we found is, how can we continue to push their exposure into the profession? And so what we also found is that some of these schools are actually located in some of the areas of the city that were historically redlined or just on the border. But what's unique to Baltimore is that, again, going back to the Black Butterfly from Dr. Lawrence Brown, some of the schools are also in communities in which funding has been historically diverted or they've been disinvested. And so the next map shows one example of that Black Butterfly overlaid. The income levels throughout the city. And as you can see, it follows that same pattern. So these are students who are in communities that are, they are exposed to the same conditions that have been presented earlier that are impacting how they live, how they go to school, how they breathe, how they eat. But they're learning those tools that could really help them to address these issues. And so what we found is engaging with high school students at this level, it gets them into the pipeline. We can encourage them to enroll in university and architecture schools and give them that early exposure into the licensure process, and so that they can push that initiative forward. And so what we're doing as a chapter, we've actually engaged with the Carver Vocational and Technical High School here in West Baltimore. Again, these are students who they actually already know AutoCAD, they know architectural drafting, they have those tools, but we plan to be supplementing that academic experience with the professional experience to really get them on the path so that they're not exposed to the profession too late, but they actually have the tools that they need to join in those efforts to address the city. And so what does all this create? This creates a more diverse pool of designers to address our society's most pressing issues. One of the best ways that this is being celebrated and elevated, and the best evidence of this is the Say It Loud exhibition that was originally founded by my colleague and mentor Pascal Sablon, who recently was elevated to the College of Fellows during last week's ceremony. So we actually just opened the Say It Loud Maryland exhibition, and in it are a number of projects, number of architects and designers who are, they were exposed to that profession at some point. They had that touch point, and so their projects are making a difference in the city and in the communities in which we live. So it shows that it should be everyone's mission to continue these efforts so that we can really move the needle and continue to showcase and elevate these opportunities for designers. And so with that, I will pass it back to Lisa.
Thanks, Melanie. So just trying to tie it all back together and connect the dots back to the beginning. As the architecture, design, and construction community, we really have a great opportunity. Over the next 40 years, 2.5 trillion square feet of construction will take place. So we have a decision of how we intend to build our communities back. This is a lot of construction. It's equivalent to building a New York City, adding a New York City to the planet every 34 days. So think about all of that square feet. We have the opportunity to enhance the health, well-being of people with our buildings. When we think about things like daylight in our classrooms, we know that it affects students' cognitive function, their emotional state, even their immune system and their connection to their own health. We know that when we work on projects in our communities, we have to connect people back to nature, back to each other, and also back to the health and well-being of the planet. So again, I'm so happy to be part of this presentation today and looking at how we heal ourselves, our communities, and our planet. There's a lot of ways to connect and advocate and collaborate in your own community. Join the Nomad chapter, the AIA committee, one of the Green Building Rating Systems advisory groups. Melanie talked about engaging this next generation, being a mentor, but not only people in the pipeline already thinking about architecture, but way early in elementary school to people who have never even thought about the word architecture, like me over in East Baltimore in 3rd grade. Be an advocate for climate justice. Legislative sessions are starting soon. Take classes like you are doing today, continuing education. If you're interested, the Eco District exam, you can take their exam for free up until tomorrow. It's also really affordable after tomorrow. Here's events increasing diversity in the environmental movement. Later on tonight, there's also a climate platform launch for Maryland, if you're calling in from that state. There's a class called Pathways to Equity. There's another smaller conference called Resilient City coming up in the spring. So thanks again, and now I'll pass it back to Ken.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I wanted to open this up for discussion. It's been a very lively and informative seminar. The things that you've been talking about have been on my mind for a long time. As an African American architect, I have to look at the statistics over time, and I've been out here for a long time and have seen a lot of changes, and yet very few changes. As Melanie pointed out, not much movement in the numbers or the percentages. Obviously, there have been more minority architects or architects of color that have joined the ranks of practicing licensed architects, but the percentages of architects that are of color or female really haven't, the needle hasn't moved very much. And that's why we're really trying to pull out all the stops to make that change happen. Project Pipeline is one thing that I wanted to talk a bit about, and that is the high school and middle school effort. It's a national program that NOMA has every summer, and it's a week-long initiation, if you will, of those students into architecture. And hopefully it will spark some belief that they can become architects in the future. And we try to take students that have some interest in either art or science or architecture and sort of give them a primer on what architecture is about. And it's been successful in promoting students, if you catch them early enough, to get into the system that Melanie and Lisa have been talking about in improving those numbers. And then the other thing I wanted to bring out is the redlining that happened way back in the late 40s, early 50s after World War II. America had a lot of money, but African Americans and Jewish people and Latino people were not being invited to live in the nicer communities. They were being told that there's no money, or our covenants don't allow you people to live here in this community or communities like it. A prime example of that, I'm from New York City, so I have that as a background and as a backdrop. Levittown is a huge development in New York City, in Long Island specifically. And that area for a very long time would not allow Blacks to live there. They were told, all right, we don't want you here. The same with Jews and other people of color, Asian people, Hispanic people. We don't want you here. Even though this is a federally funded project, the government supports it, the FHA funds it, we don't want you here. And just a blatant kind of process that limited the wealth building that most Americans experience when they buy a home. And that becomes a legacy for their kids, and then their kids buy homes, and it goes down the line. But if you're denied that, you're still staying in apartments and paying rent, and you're not achieving any kind of wealth at all. So that's a major problem in our society. But I wanted to open up the floor, and I see we have a number of questions, and I have some of my own that I want to interject. But let's start with Maury, the AIA. He asks, your work with large firms is admirable. What immediate initiatives are either underway or focus areas to mid-level and small firms concurrently? So do either of you, Melanie or Lisa, want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I think that question is in reference, right, to the Nomad Fellowship that was founded with the large firm roundtable. So I think it's undeniable. I think the impact that the larger firms in the profession have on kind of the overall direction, and maybe we might be a little biased as we're part of that group, but a large proportion of architects are employed by these larger firms, and so to kind of get the conversation started, that was the impetus of the development of that program. We started it. It was intended to start the summer of 2020. So we were in the midst of planning in February. March of 2020 hit. We were planning to send all these students to, different cities across the country, and had to completely pivot. And so it turned into an online program opportunity. But what that did was guarantee employment for a lot of students whose internships were rescinded that summer. Since that year, the program has gotten so much excitement. So many firms are interested in being a part of this program, including the smaller and mid-sized firms. And so we're actually in the process right now of, redesigning the program again, because we'll see what summer 2022 looks like. But our hope is that this program will continue to grow, that firms will be able to join it and get engaged beyond that core group, but this becomes something that all firms would look forward to. But outside of that, it also becomes a touch point for firms to take this and do their own initiatives. And so we actually had a number of firms that were a part of the first year of NFF. And then the following year, they went to career fairs of HBCUs. They went to directly start hiring and changing their internships and entry-level positions to be more targeted with their hiring. And so this is, again, is that example of, yes, it might be one touch point or one introduction, but it completely shifts the mindset of firms and practicing. So, we're definitely actively looking for opportunities to expand that pool and continue to engage with all firms at different sizes. And that was just the beginning. That we're gonna keep moving forward with that.
Yes.
I'll just add a little layer onto that as well. The large firm roundtable has a bunch of different committees. So there's also a sustainability version of that. And together we talk about how do we move the needle for the whole profession. So if we can dedicate some of our resources together to figure out things like how do we make it easier for firms to track data for the 2030 challenge, how do we connect climate justice with sustainability in general, then can we actually move the needle for the whole profession and make it easier for the medium and smaller firms to follow along?
Okay, well, thank you for those responses. Kim Smith asks, how do firms sign up for the opportunity to participate in the NOMA-sponsored HBCU Professional Development Program?
Yeah, you can reach out directly to NOMA at info@noma.net. I can also drop my email in the chat, my NOMA email as well. And so, we're looking for firms to be a partner of that. You can learn a little bit more information about that.
And here, to add on to what you're saying, Melanie, here in Virginia, we are trying to assemble different organizations that are to work collaboratively on this issue. We have a couple of HBCUs, one particularly Hampton University, that has a strong architecture program and is a pretty strong advocate of NOMA. In fact, the head of the architecture program at Hampton is a former NOMA president, as am I. And we are collaborating together on how we can get more involved in this effort. So it's spreading, I want to say, in a positive way. Baltimore, Maryland, Richmond, Virginia, and other communities are picking up the baton and moving forward with it. So that's one of the things we're doing. Willie Cooper, Virginia, I know you, Willie. are there efforts to connect to contractors and developers to build greener partnerships in building? As much as we would like to think we can change the world, we are only part of the team. So do either of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can start there. Thanks for the question. And you're right. We're all just part of the team. I know when I go and talk to grade school students about, people think I'm coming in to talk about architecture, and I don't really talk about architecture at all. I really talk about sustainability and how we really need students to think about sustainability and these connections, no matter what part of the process they're in, right? Architects, landscape planners, developers, building owners, principals of schools. So I would say a lot of the rating systems have a way to sort of connect the pieces. There's always sort of the design part and the construction part. Systems like WELL really gets into the building operations of the company itself. I'm going to go back to just again to promote the point about architects advocating for legislation. We know there's a lot of different types of developers out there that want to do the right thing, and some just don't. But if we can advocate for laws to make this the case, then we can again raise up the base of our communities, right? It wasn't until the Fair Housing Act that the redlining practice was banned, right? And again, it's still sort of going on, but that had to happen to make it stop. So can we do the same thing with inclusion, with energy codes, all of those things? I actually just this morning, there's a group called IMT, I think market transformation, I forget, innovative market transformation. They have a guide for developers, 10 steps to sort of get to 2030 to how to make your buildings better. So I can, we can go on to the next question. I can try to find that link as well to put in the chat, or again, like Melanie said, feel free to connect with us after the presentation to talk more.
Let me speak a minute. One of the things that we're trying to initiate, at least here in Virginia, is a collaborative effort between the AIA and NOMA, or VA NOMA in this case. We share several seminars like this one that speak to having not just architects and engineers, but also student groups. We have a wing of NOMA that is called NOMAS, very similar to the AIA student group. And we're in Virginia anyway, 5 different university campuses. And we're having a session later on this week to talk about how we can collaborate and get some of these initiatives moving in the right direction. So there is an attempt on all of our parts to try to make that happen. So let me get to the next question if I can. So over the years, sustainability has become canon in architectural design. And how will equity also become a necessity in our practice? Melanie, you want to speak to that first?
Absolutely. So sustainability has become so core to what we do, and it's almost impossible to think that just 2 decades ago, it was almost too far off, like, oh, that's too lofty of a goal, that we can't incorporate that into our work because it's just too complicated. And I remember meeting an architect when I was younger, and I was aspiring, and I mentioned then, and he asked me what I was interested in studying. And I mentioned that I was interested in incorporating sustainable design into my work. And even at that time, he's like, oh, that's that's a pipe dream. That's not happening. That's short-lived. But here we are. We're talking about it regularly, and it's incorporated into the building code and into all of our requirements. There's a number of reviews. You can't get a building passed and approved and built without at least thinking about that. And so I see equity following that same trajectory. And I mentioned that we're seeing it more and more in a lot of our RFPs from certain clients, that they are demanding to see that, and you cannot get projects without being able to demonstrate that authentic diversity within our firms. And so I think it really is only going to become more and more of a necessity as the demographics of our country continue to shift, as it becomes more and more of a requirement to get the work done.
Mhm. Lisa, any comments?
I definitely agree. And I think, again, going back to the theme of the presentation today, is to not look at it as something separate. The more that we can connect these things together and work on them together, is the same way. So sustainability conferences I go to, it's the same way when you go to architecture conferences. There's a missing piece of people of color in those environments as well. So again, how do we increase people to be interested in the architecture pipeline, and also to fight for the bigger picture of the communities and the planet as well?
Here in Virginia, we had a statewide chapter, first of all, and then our project pipeline initiative, which happened during the summer, was a week-long exercise. And I mentioned Hampton University, but they also had a program that they did during the summer, and it dovetailed with our program. So students had 2 weeks of architectural information, knowledge, and they got to do a collaborative project. Actually, it was one of my projects at the Petersburg Library, which we are renovating and converting to a museum, historical museum. And so we were all able to work together to make that happen. But the initiatives that we put into place can only happen if we all collaborate. I think there has to be a very strong effort to get us in the same room, at the same table, talking the same language, and moving those initiatives forward. And I'm happy to see that in our part of the world, as in other parts of our country, let's say, that is happening. And it's going to take a lot of initiatives for all of us to come together to make change happen, especially in the environment. So Lisa and Melanie, I applaud your efforts. It sounds like your firm is really upping the ante on sustainability and equity and economics. So let me go on to the next question here. So what are some of the obstacles that designers must overcome to integrate equity in the design process? Either one of you can sort of talk to that.
So we actually just took a look at this internally and tried to understand what are those obstacles that each of our team members are experiencing. And so the first obstacle, I think, for everyone is that comfortability. So understanding and making sure that we are all comfortable speaking to the issue of equity, that we know the terminology, that we understand the history. And so, again, similarly to sustainable design, if we don't understand what green rating systems are, if we don't understand what those goals and intentions are behind the requirements, then we're not really sure what we can do and how we can incorporate that into projects. And so the first step is education. And we had highlighted a couple of those ways to learn and get more exposure into equity in the profession. So once you've got that ability to speak to it comfortably, And then it's just a matter of having those open conversations and being able to address that either within the design process and really starting to integrate it intentionally into what we do. So it's not an afterthought that comes, at the end of the construction documents process, but it's something that's initiated at the project kickoff that we're asking the right questions a part of the process.
All right. So at this point, folks, I'm going to sort of close it out, but I wanted to give the opportunity to Matt Alexander, who's chairman of the Committee on the Environment for the AIA Virginia, to give us some parting words. Matt?
Thanks a lot, Ken. So first of all, again, I'd like to thank the panelists, Melanie and Lisa, and of course, Kenneth, as our moderator, and everyone for attending this webinar. It's been really informative, a lot of information here, a lot to digest. I'm still digesting a lot of it myself. And I think that what this really tells us is, there's a lot here to study, to learn, and this was intentional. We have 3 different organizations, Education, NOMA, and the Committee on the Environment, and it's intentional, this overlap, to talk about all these issues because they all affect us. So again, thank you everyone, and I'd just like to add, we're going to be putting contact information in the chat for the 3 organizations, and I think it just went in for AIA Nova, CAE, COAT, and NOMA, all the acronyms. So again, thank you so much for joining us.